The most brutal deaths in history didn't happen in some medieval dungeon. A lot of them happened right here in America, committed by Americans, and in some cases, by the American government itself. And the thing is, most of this stuff never makes it into textbooks, which means millions of people have no idea any of it even happened. Now, just a heads up. The cases in this video get progressively worse as we go, so if you want to get to the really disturbing ones, you're going to want to stick around to the end, because what we finish on is honestly hard to sit with. Let's start with one that's more strange than brutal. In 1871, in Hamilton, Ohio, there was a lawyer named Clement Vallandigham. He wasn't just some small-town attorney either. He'd been a congressman. He was well-known, and he had a reputation for taking on difficult cases and winning. So when he took on the defense of a man accused of murder, he came in with a real strategy. The prosecution's case was that his client had shot and killed a man during a bar fight. Vallandigham's whole defense was built around the argument that the victim hadn't been shot by anyone else, that the victim had accidentally shot himself while drawing his own pistol. And Vallandigham was so committed to making this point land that the night before the hearing, while meeting with other lawyers in a hotel room, he decided to physically act it out and show exactly how it could have happened. He grabbed a pistol from the room to use as a prop, except he grabbed the loaded one instead of the unloaded one sitting right next to it. He shot himself in the stomach. His exact words right after were, "My God, I've shot myself." He died the following morning, and his client, and the man he was defending, was acquitted. The demonstration worked, just not for Vallandigham personally. Now, that one is more of a tragic accident wrapped in extraordinary irony, but as we keep going, things get a lot less accidental. Most people know the basics of the Salem witch trials, 1692, Massachusetts, a town gripped by fear and paranoia, and a lot of innocent people hanged for crimes that weren't real. But there was one man whose death was completely different from all the others, and it's probably the most drawn-out, agonizing execution in all of American history. His name was Giles Corey, and he was 80 years old. He'd been accused of witchcraft, which he denied, but rather than entering a plea, guilty or not guilty, he refused to say anything at all in court. And that wasn't him just being stubborn. It was actually a calculated decision, because under the law at the time, if you didn't enter a plea, you couldn't be formally tried. And if you couldn't be tried, you couldn't be convicted. And if you couldn't be convicted, the court couldn't seize your property when you died. He was protecting his family's inheritance. He knew exactly what he was doing and what it was going to cost him. The court's response was a method called pressing, and it was exactly what it sounds like. They stripped him, laid him on the ground outside, placed a wooden board over his body, and began stacking heavy stones on top of it one by one. The idea was that the pain would eventually become so unbearable that he'd cave and enter a plea just to make it stop. And they didn't pile everything on at once. They added weight gradually over the course of multiple days, so there was no quick end to it. His ribs cracked, his organs were compressed, breathing became increasingly difficult and then nearly impossible. And when they asked him again if he would enter a plea, after everything, he looked up and said two words: more weight. He never entered that plea. He died under those stones. His property passed to his family exactly as he intended. He was 80 years old, and he held out to the very end, which is one of the more quietly remarkable things in early American history, but also one of the most brutal deaths you could imagine happening to a person. Now we're jumping forward to 1957, and this one shifts from brutal to something that's harder to define. It's disturbing in a quieter way, and the fact that it's never fully been solved makes it worse. On February 25th of 1957, a man walking through a field in northeast Philadelphia spotted a cardboard box near the side of a road. Inside it was the body of a young boy, somewhere between 4 and 6 years old, wrapped in a plaid blanket. He had been badly beaten. Bruises covered his body. His head had taken multiple impacts, and he had other signs of prolonged abuse. Whoever left him there made no real attempt to hide him. The box was just sitting out in the open by the road. What made investigators especially uneasy was the state of his hair. It had been very recently cut, but done poorly and clumsily, like someone had just grabbed a pair of scissors and hacked at it right before placing him in that box. The belief was that it had been done deliberately to change his appearance and make him harder to identify. His fingernails and toenails had been carefully cleaned and trimmed as well, which suggests that at some point in his short life, someone had actually been caring for him. That part doesn't make it easier. Philadelphia launched one of the largest missing persons investigations the city had ever conducted. His face went into newspapers. Flyers were posted everywhere. Thousands of tips came in. Nobody could identify him. For decades, he was buried in a cemetery where his grave marker simply read, "America's Unknown Child." It wasn't until 2019 that DNA genealogy research finally produced a credible lead on who he might have been. But the case has never been fully closed, and nobody has ever been charged. Whoever hurt that little boy, whoever put him in a box on the side of the road, they almost certainly never faced anything for it. Staying in the South, and this one is less violent and more just genuinely unexplainable in a way that tends to stick with you. In 1976, a hunter walking through a forest in Georgia noticed something odd at the base of a large elm tree. A pair of shoes sticking up out of a hollow in the trunk. When he got closer, he found a body wedged inside. The remains were those of a woman who had gone into the hollow of that tree from the top opening and gotten stuck. Based on everything investigators could determine, she had gone in voluntarily. There were no signs of anyone else being involved, no evidence of a struggle, no indication that she was put there by another person. She climbed in on her own. She was eventually identified as Ora Mae Cowan, a 26-year-old woman from the area, and researchers and investigators have never been able to agree on why she went into that tree in the first place. Some theories suggest she may have been trying to retrieve something, an animal or an object that had fallen in. Others have speculated she was hiding from someone. None of it has ever been confirmed. What is known is that she was found in a position that strongly suggested she had been trying to push herself back up and out and couldn't manage it. She died in there, stuck, alone, and based on the condition of the remains, it had been a significant amount of time before anyone found her. Sometimes it's the cases with no clear answer that are the most uncomfortable to sit with. Now, this one involves a group of women, and while it gets mentioned occasionally in history classes, the actual physical reality of what happened to their bodies is something most people have never fully heard described. In the 1910s and 1920s, hundreds of young women were hired by watch manufacturing companies, primarily the United States Radium Corporation in Orange, New Jersey, to paint watch dials with radium-based paint. Radium made the dials glow in the dark, which made them popular for military use and consumer sales. The problem was the painting technique. The brushes would lose their shape quickly, so supervisors actually instructed the women to use their lips to reshape the brush tip before each stroke. Lip, dip, paint. That was the standard method they were all taught. The women were told repeatedly that the radium was completely harmless. Some of them painted their nails with it. A few painted their teeth so they'd glow at parties. They had no reason to think anything was wrong. For a while, nothing seemed wrong. Then they started getting sick. Teeth began falling out. Jaws began to deteriorate, not just weaken, but actually crumble, because the radium had been absorbed into their bones the same way calcium is, and it was slowly breaking down the bone tissue from the inside out. Some women had to have their entire lower jaw surgically removed because the bone had decayed past the point of saving. Tumors developed, holes formed in their skulls, and the company had internal documents the whole time showing that executives were aware of the dangers and had actively worked to hide the medical findings and undermine the credibility of the women who came forward sick. Several of them died before their cases reached court, but a group of them, the ones who became known as the Radium Girls, fought back and eventually won a settlement that helped establish the first real workplace safety protections in American law. What they went through to get there was extraordinary, and the fact that every bit of it was preventable and knowingly allowed to happen makes it one of the darker chapters in American corporate history. And since we're talking about organizations that knew and did nothing, or worse, actively made things worse, this next one goes a step further because this wasn't negligence. This was a deliberate policy decision. During Prohibition in the 1920s and early 1930s, the U.S. government made a calculated choice that led directly to the deaths of thousands of American citizens. When alcohol was banned, people didn't stop drinking. They got it from bootleggers, and bootleggers were increasingly turning to industrial alcohol as a base, redistilling it to make it consumable. The government knew this was happening, so they ordered that industrial alcohol be laced with toxic substances, methanol, kerosene, and eventually a formula that included things like strychnine and other poisons, specifically to deter people from drinking it. By the time Prohibition ended, an estimated 10,000 Americans had died from drinking this poisoned alcohol, and tens of thousands more were left permanently disabled. One product called Ginger Jake, sold as a medicinal ginger extract to technically stay within the law, ended up paralyzing up to 100,000 people with a condition called Jake leg, which left them with a permanent dragging, shuffling gait for the rest of their lives. Many never recovered any normal movement. When journalists and doctors pushed back at the time and asked how the government could justify this, officials essentially said that people who were breaking the law by drinking knew what they were getting into, and whatever happened was their own fault. That argument was made while those same officials were signing off on rat poison being added to bottles that American citizens were consuming. It's one of those things that once you know it, it doesn't really leave you. There are two connected threads here that don't have neat explanations, and I want to put them together because they both fall into the same category of genuinely unresolved and quietly unsettling. The first is something that search and rescue workers have reported for years. Random staircases appearing deep in forests, completely out of context, miles from any structure or development. Just a set of stairs, freestanding in the middle of the woods, attached to nothing. Multiple SAR officers across different states have described encountering these, and a strange recurring detail in their accounts is that they're trained to avoid them and to not let the people they're rescuing touch them. Some of the missing persons cases in remote forested areas have involved people last seen near or walking towards structures like these, though that connection has never been officially confirmed. Nobody has a clean explanation for why these keep appearing, and most official agencies don't really acknowledge them at all. The second thread is better documented, but equally unresolved. Starting in the late 1990s and continuing for decades, a pattern emerged across the Midwest and East Coast. Young men, most of them college-aged, athletic, and healthy, were being found drowned in rivers and bodies of water after being last seen near bars or parties. Over 40 cases in multiple states. What caught the attention of two retired FBI agents named Kevin Gannon and Anthony Duarte, who spent years building a case around this, was how consistent the details were. The victims were almost always young white men between 18 and 30. Alcohol levels in their system at autopsy were often lower than you'd expect for someone who'd stumbled into a river. Most of them were strong swimmers, and in a significant number of cases, graffiti smiley faces, simple, basic ones, were found spray-painted near where the bodies were recovered. Gannon and Duarte concluded that many of these deaths were likely homicides, staged to look like accidental drownings. Local law enforcement largely disagreed. The FBI has never officially classified them as murders. And that ambiguity is what makes this so difficult. Because if they're right, then there are dozens of families who were told their son drowned by accident when something else entirely may have happened. No identification, no charges, just a pattern that keeps repeating. Now, this one is less of a mystery and more just a documented disaster that barely gets talked about despite being one of the deadliest workplace events in American history. In the early 1930s, Union Carbide Corporation hired thousands of workers, a large portion of them black men from the South looking for employment, to drill a tunnel through Gauley Mountain in West Virginia, meant to redirect river water to a hydroelectric plant. As drilling progressed, engineers testing the rock discovered that sections of the mountain were made almost entirely of near-pure silica. Silica dust, when inhaled, causes a lung disease that hardens and scars tissue, until a person can no longer breathe. Standard safety practice required wet drilling, proper ventilation, and respirators when silica was present at those concentrations. None of that was consistently provided. Workers were drilling dry, in enclosed spaces, breathing clouds of silica dust for 8 to 10 hours a day. Men started dying within months, not years, months, because the exposure was so extreme. Some were quietly buried in a nearby field by the company because they didn't want the death count to become public. Official estimates put the death toll between 476 and over 1,000 workers. Unofficial estimates from researchers go as high as 2,000. Families received settlements averaging a few $100s per death. Union Carbide admitted nothing. It remains one of the largest industrial disasters in American history, and most people have never heard of it. Most people can name the Titanic. Far fewer people can name the Sultana, and that's strange, considering it killed more people and the circumstances surrounding it are somehow even more tragic. It was April 27, 1865. The Civil War had just ended days earlier. Lincoln had just been assassinated. The country was in complete chaos, and in the middle of all of that, a steamboat called the Sultana was making its way up the Mississippi River loaded with Union soldiers who had just been released from Confederate prison camps, places like Andersonville, where men had been starved, beaten, and worked until their bodies gave out. These were men who had survived years of that. They were finally going home. The Sultana was legally cleared to carry 376 passengers. That night, it was carrying somewhere between 2,000 and 2,400 people. The boat was so overcrowded that men were packed onto every surface, sitting on railings, crammed into every corner of every deck. And in the early hours of the morning, 3 of the boat's 4 boilers exploded simultaneously. The blast tore the upper decks apart. Men who weren't killed instantly were thrown into the Mississippi River in the dark, in April, when the water was cold and running fast from spring flooding. Many of the survivors were so weakened from months in prison camps that they couldn't stay afloat. Others grabbed onto debris only to have other desperate men grab the same piece and pull everyone under. Some accounts describe men clinging to trees along the flooded riverbanks for hours in freezing water before help arrived. Over 1,800 people died. Some estimates put it higher. It remains the deadliest maritime disaster in American history, more deaths than the Titanic, and it happened to men who had already survived some of the worst conditions of the entire war. The reason almost nobody knows about it is that it was completely buried by news coverage of Lincoln's assassination and the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth. A story about 1,800 dead soldiers just didn't get the attention it deserved, and somehow, more than 150 years later, it still hasn't. And now, the final case, and this is the one that's hardest to move past. On April 27, 1978, at a coal plant under construction in Willow Island, West Virginia, a partially completed cooling tower collapsed while workers were on it. 51 men fell. All of them died. The collapse happened in seconds. Scaffolding failed, triggered a chain reaction, and the whole structure came down before anyone on the ground could fully register what was happening. And here's the part that's difficult to think about. Some of the workers were actively pouring concrete when the tower came down, and several of them were caught in the wet concrete as the structure collapsed around them. Their bodies couldn't be recovered. They are still there. Those men went to work on an ordinary morning in 1978, and their remains are still inside that structure today because there was no safe way to retrieve them. Investigations afterward found multiple safety violations and oversight failures. It was ruled an industrial accident. Families sued and received settlements. But for the families of the men entombed in that concrete, there was never a burial, never a grave to visit, never a proper goodbye. Just a structure that still stands with their fathers and sons and brothers inside it. And that's kind of the thing that connects most of what we covered today. Not just that the deaths were brutal, but that in case after case, someone knew something was wrong and either said nothing, covered it up, or deliberately made it worse. The boy in the box had his identity stripped away. The Radium Girls had a company hiding the evidence. The government literally poisoned people and called it their own fault. And 51 men in West Virginia are still waiting to come home. If you made it to the end, genuinely appreciate you sticking around. If you want more videos digging into stuff like this, hit subscribe because there's a lot more where this came from. Until next time.